The mirror had been in the Hartley family for 3 generations, and it had the particular quality of very old glass, a slight warp at one corner that made a person standing to the left of it appear, for just a moment, to be someone else entirely. Someone had been moving things in the house. Small things. The kind of changes a person might imagine rather than see. Welcome to Mystery Stories, where every shadow hides a secret and every cup of tea may be your last. Settle in, pour yourself something warm, and let the story begin. Chapter 1. The Glass That Remembers. The mirror had been in the Hartley family for 3 generations, and it had the particular quality of very old glass, a slight warp at one corner that made a person standing to the left of it appear, for just a moment, to be someone else entirely. It hung in the entrance hall of Hartley Lodge, which was the sort of house that had once been grand and now contented itself with being merely comfortable. The paintwork around the front door was beginning to peel in one corner. The wisteria had gone untrimmed for 2 summers. These were the small details that a house cannot hide, however well it keeps everything else. Miss Jane Marple noticed them the moment the taxi drew up. She had come to the village of Chetford-under-Wick on what she described to her niece as a restful visit. Her niece, who knew her rather well, had looked at her with mild suspicion and said nothing. The village itself was the sort of place that resists description, because it fits so perfectly into the idea of what an English village ought to be. There was a post office that also sold sweets and the better sort of pickle. There was a church of the 12th century with a war memorial that listed 7 names from one family. There was a public house called the Lamb and Fleece, which smelled of old wood and good intentions, and there was a village green that grew slightly yellower each August. And on the eastern edge of the green, set back behind a wall of Cotswold stone, there was Hartley Lodge. Miss Marple had been invited to stay by Mrs. Evelyn Hartley, whom she had known at some remove for 40 years. They had met at a flower show in Taunton, had corresponded irregularly on the subject of dahlias, and had arrived at the particular variety of friendship that requires no maintenance but survives indefinitely. Mrs. Hartley was 71, widowed, and possessed of what Miss Marple privately thought of as excellent practical intelligence, a quality quite different from cleverness and rarer. "Jane," said Evelyn Hartley, meeting her at the door with both hands extended and a warmth that was entirely genuine. "You look remarkably well for someone who has spent 3 hours on a train." "The window seat," said Miss Marple. "I always find the window seat restoring." They went inside, and it was there, standing in the cool hallway, while Evelyn Hartley spoke to the young woman who came in to help on Tuesdays and Thursdays, that Miss Marple found herself looking at the mirror. It was large and framed in dark wood, slightly foxed at the edges in the way of very old glass, and in it, reflected from the drawing-room behind her, she could see through the half-open door a vase of roses, deep red ones, drooping slightly, and beside them, a photograph in a silver frame. She could not quite see whose photograph it was from this angle. She noted this, in the way she noted everything, without attaching particular importance to it. Later, she would think about that. Chapter 2. Tea and Introductions. There were 5 of them for tea that first afternoon, which was, Miss Marple reflected privately, precisely the number of people required for a situation to become complicated. Tea at Hartley Lodge was served in the drawing-room at 4 o'clock with a punctuality that brooked no negotiation. The tea itself was strong enough to be taken seriously. The scones were the kind that split cleanly along their natural fault lines, which Miss Marple considered a reliable indicator of competence in the baker. Evelyn Hartley poured. On her left sat her daughter, Caroline, who was 44 and had recently returned from London under circumstances that had not been fully explained to anyone in the village, though this had not prevented the village from forming several theories. Caroline had her mother's good bone structure, but held herself with the particular tension of someone who had learned to expect disappointment and had not entirely stopped being surprised by it. She drank her tea quickly and looked at her watch once, in a way she clearly hoped no one noticed. Across from Caroline sat Dr. Philip Morrow, who who was the village doctor and had been for 12 years. He was 50, with clever hands and a manner of listening that gave the impression, not always accurate, that he was taking notes. He was the sort of doctor who remembered not only his patients' symptoms, but their dogs' names, and this had made him very trusted, which is not quite the same thing as being well-liked. "You'll find Chetford under Wick very peaceful, Miss Marple," he said, setting down his teacup with the precise economy of movement that characterized everything he did. "I find most villages peaceful on first acquaintance," said Miss Marple pleasantly. The fifth member of their party was a young man named Thomas Hartley, Evelyn's nephew, who was staying at the lodge while his flat in Bristol was being painted, or so he said. He was 28, with the restless quality of someone not quite sure what they are waiting for, and he had positioned himself near the window in a way that allowed him to see both the garden and the door to the hallway simultaneously. Miss Marple noticed this. She thought of it as the escape configuration, a seating choice she associated with people expecting either a visitor or an argument. "The garden is looking rather dry," said Miss Marple, looking out through the French doors. "We've had no real rain since the 3rd of July, said Evelyn Hartley. Hubert never allowed the lawn to go like that. He had views about lawns. A small silence settled. Hubert Hartley had been dead for 8 years. The lawn had grown no worse in 8 years than many lawns in normal circumstances. It occurred to Miss Marple that this was not, in fact, about the lawn at all. Caroline set down her teacup with slightly more force than was necessary. "I've said I'll speak to the gardener," she said. "Briggs," said Thomas, from his window, apparently to no one in particular, "has had rather a lot on his mind recently." No one asked what he meant. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked. Outside, a bee attended to the lavender beside the French doors with absolute single-mindedness, indifferent to the human weather inside the room. Chapter 3. What Briggs Said. Miss Marple had always found that the most useful conversations happened in gardens, standing up, with no particular appointment. The following morning, having slept extremely well on account of excellent curtains and a mattress that had been chosen by someone with practical good sense, she rose at 7 and took her cardigan and her small pruning gloves, she never traveled without them, and went out through the kitchen door into the back garden. The air was the particular cool of an August morning before the sun has quite committed itself. The grass held dew, and the smell of it was green and clean and faintly animal. A wood pigeon made its enquiry somewhere in the chestnut tree at the garden's edge, received no reply, and tried again. She found the gardener at the far end of the vegetable plot, doing something precise and unhurried with a row of bean canes. His name, as Thomas had mentioned, was Briggs. He was perhaps 60, with the leathered forearms of a man who has worked outside since boyhood and the considering expression of someone who weighs words the way he might weigh seed, taking only exactly what is needed. "Morning," he said, without looking up from the beans. "Good morning," said Miss Marple. "The sweet peas have done very well this year." He looked up at that. A small assessment. "Not bad," he said. "Early rain. Won't last." "Nothing in a garden does," said Miss Marple equably, and bent to look at the sweet peas with what was entirely genuine appreciation. They worked in companionable proximity for a while. Miss Marple deadheading along the border, Briggs attending to his beans. The wood pigeon tried once more and gave up entirely. "You'll have met the family," said Briggs eventually, in the tone of someone who is offering information and not requesting it. "At tea yesterday," said Miss Marple. "A pleasant gathering." Briggs made a sound that was not quite a word. "The young man, Mr. Thomas, he mentioned you'd had rather a lot on your mind," said Miss Marple, with a lightness that made the enquiry feel like a casual observation rather than a question. The bean canes received several moments of unnecessary adjustment. "My daughter works up at the lodge," Briggs said finally. "Tuesday, Thursday, and mornings sometimes." He paused. "She's seen things." "What sort of things?" said Miss Marple, without particular emphasis. "Things she shouldn't have." He tied a knot in a piece of twine with the deliberate economy of a man who chooses all his actions. "Things that don't explain themselves proper." He said nothing more after that, and Miss Marple did not press him, because pressing was never the way with men like Briggs. You simply made it clear that you had heard and that you were not alarmed, and you waited. She went back to the sweet peas, but she was thinking, as she worked, about the photograph in the silver frame, the one she had glimpsed through the drawing-room door in the mirror's reflection on her arrival. She had passed through the drawing-room twice now, and the photograph was always there, on the side table beside the roses. But it was always turned, very slightly, with its face away from the main light, so that you had to position yourself deliberately to see it clearly. She made a point of not doing so. Not yet. Chapter 4. The Photograph in Silver. It rained on the third morning, decisively and without apology, the way rain in late summer sometimes does, as though making up for lost time. Miss Marple sat by the drawing-room window with her knitting, and found this very satisfactory. She was making a cardigan for her niece in a shade of blue that her niece had described as periwinkle, but which was, in Miss Marple's estimation, rather more accurately cornflower. She had said nothing about this because it was not, in the scheme of things, important. She cast on 12 stitches, listened to the rain speak against the window panes, and waited. She did not have to wait very long. Evelyn Hartley came in at 10:30 with a tray, 11s, which she always prepared herself, and which always included a small dish of those particular shortbread biscuits that come in a tartan tin, and settled into the chair opposite with the sigh of someone who has been upright for long. Enough. The rain moved across the garden in a series of gray curtains. "That's Hubert," said Evelyn Hartley. Miss Marple looked up. She had not asked. The older woman was looking at the photograph in the silver frame. It was the first time she had mentioned it directly, and her voice had the studied neutrality of someone who has been saving a sentence. "He was a handsome man," said Miss Marple. "He was." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. That photograph was taken in 1987. We were in Corfu. She paused. "I've had it on that table for 30 years. It faces the window so the light doesn't fade the paper." Miss Marple knitted 2 stitches. "Someone moved it," said Evelyn, very quietly and without drama, in the way that the most serious things are often said. "About 3 weeks ago. I came down one morning and it had been turned. Turned so it faced the wall. Could someone have knocked it, perhaps? I thought that. I put it back. The next morning it was turned again." She looked at her hands, which were steady. "I asked Caroline. She said she hadn't touched it. I believed her." "Thomas?" said Miss Marple. "He'd only arrived the day before. I asked him." She paused. "He said he hadn't touched it either, and I believed him too, which is where I begin to find things rather difficult." The rain intensified briefly, then settled back to its steady rhythm. "The girl who comes in, Briggs's daughter," said Miss Marple. "Amy. She was here on the Tuesday. I didn't ask her." Evelyn looked at the photograph with the expression of someone who has reached the end of the reasonable explanations and is standing on the edge of the unreasonable ones. "It's a small thing, Jane. I know that. It's a very small thing. And I am not a foolish woman." "No," said Miss Marple. "You are not a foolish woman at all." She picked up her knitting again. The rain tapped at the window. Somewhere inside the house, a door closed gently, and footsteps moved across the hallway floor, and then were still. "Has anything else happened?" said Miss Marple. "Anything small?" There was a pause that told her the answer before Evelyn spoke. "Yes," said Evelyn Hartley. "Rather several things, actually." Chapter 5. The Small Disturbances. Miss Marple had observed, over a long life of careful attention, that trouble in a household announces itself in the manner of bad weather approaching across an open field. Not in one definitive event, but in a series of small preliminary signs that, individually mean nothing but collectively mean a great deal. A shifted photograph. That was the first. There had also been, and here Evelyn listed them in the careful tone of someone who has been turning them over privately for some time. A letter that went missing from the hall table. "Nothing important," Evelyn said. A letter from the bank, the sort of thing one expects to find when one expects to find it. It had been there at 11 in the morning and gone by 4, and she had found it eventually tucked beneath the silver letter tray itself, as though it had simply slid there unassisted. Then there was the business with the wine cellar. Hubert had kept a proper cellar, and Evelyn maintained it in his memory, and because she liked a good Burgundy on Sundays. She had gone down 2 weeks ago and found 3 bottles laid horizontally that she was certain she had left standing upright. The labels were important. 2 of the standing ones were ready to drink and 1 was not, and someone had transposed them so that the unready bottle was now prominent. Someone who knew wine, said Miss Marple. Or someone who didn't, and simply moved things at random, said Evelyn. Both possibilities have their implications, said Miss Marple. The third small disturbance was perhaps the most unsettling, because it was the most personal. A pair of Evelyn's gloves, kid leather, light gray, kept in the small drawer of the console table in the hall, had appeared one morning laid out flat on the table's surface rather than inside it. Palms up, fingers extended. Evelyn described this in a voice that was quite steady, and Miss Marple listened in a way that was quite steady too, and for a moment they were 2 elderly women sitting with a shared understanding of the fact that some things are frightening precisely because they are so small. "Do you feel," said Miss Marple carefully, "that someone is trying to suggest something to you? To make you feel something in particular?" Evelyn thought about this with commendable seriousness. "Unsettled," she said at last. "I feel it is intended to make me feel unsettled, and I am rather annoyed about that." "Quite right," said Miss Marple. She put down her knitting and looked at the gray morning garden with the attentive stillness that her niece would have recognized as a particular quality of concentration, the kind that does not announce itself. She was thinking about the people in the house. 3 of them, Caroline, Thomas, and Amy Briggs, had independent access and independent movements. Dr. Morrow visited twice weekly by habit, and more often when called. The house had no other regular visitors that Evelyn had mentioned. She was also thinking about something her gardening neighbor in St. Mary Mead, old Colonel Frobisher, had once said to her entirely in the context of a chess problem, that the most effective move is rarely the dramatic one. The effective move is the one that changes how the other player thinks, without them quite knowing why their thinking has changed. Someone was moving photographs and gloves and bottles of wine. Someone wanted Evelyn Hartley to feel watched. The question, Miss Marple thought, pressing her fingertips together in her lap in what appeared to be a pleasant attitude of repose, was whether the someone was in the house or had once been in the house. And the question beneath that question was what precisely they wanted. Chapter 6. Caroline at the Window. It had been Miss Marple's experience that the people closest to a problem were rarely the best place to see it clearly, which was not a failing of character, but simply a function of proximity. She watched Caroline Hartley across the next 2 days with the patient and entirely undemonstrative interest that she brought to most things, and she learned the following, none of it by asking. Caroline woke early. There were footsteps at 6:30 each morning, moving from the guest corridor to the bathroom and back, and then down the stairs to the kitchen where the sound of the kettle spoke of habit and sleeplessness in equal measure. She made coffee, not tea. She took it to the small sitting room at the front of the house, where she sat for an hour, and this Miss Marple deduced from the fact that when she herself came down at 7, the front sitting room door was always ajar, and the air smelled faintly of coffee, already cooled. She walked to the post office each morning at 9:15. She returned 20 minutes later. She bought the same newspaper and one other thing, which changed daily. Once a tin of golden syrup, once a packet of the sort of plain biscuits that suggest purposeful eating rather than pleasure, once a small notepad with a blue cover. She wrote letters in the afternoon. Private letters, sealed and posted herself. She did not leave them on the hall table. Caroline was always the responsible one, said Evelyn Hartley, without particular inflection, one evening over supper. Thomas had gone to the Lamb and Fleece, and it was just the 2 of them, which Miss Marple suspected Evelyn had arranged. Was she happy in London? A pause of the meaningful variety. She was busy in London. It amounts to the same thing for some people. And does it? For Caroline? Evelyn turned her wine glass. It was one of the ready burgundies, and it was very good. She left a situation, she said carefully. A professional situation. There was some difficulty. Miss Marple said nothing, which was one of her more useful habits. She worked for a solicitor's firm, said Evelyn, in the tone of someone who has decided to say the thing. A senior partner. They had been close for some years. He was married. He is still married. I see, said Miss Marple. She said she didn't know, said Evelyn. And I believe her. Caroline is many things, but she is not dishonest. She set down her glass. The wife found out. There was an incident. Caroline resigned, which was the correct thing to do, and came home, which was also the correct thing to do. When was this? She arrived 6 weeks ago. Evelyn was quiet for a moment, and the small disturbances began approximately 3 weeks ago. Miss Marple absorbed this with a slight movement of the head. She doesn't know about the photograph in the gloves, said Evelyn. I haven't told her. That may be wise. For now. After supper, Miss Marple went to the drawing room on the pretext of retrieving her reading glasses, which she had, in fact, left there deliberately, and stood for a moment beside the side table with the roses, which were fresh this week and a paler pink, and the photograph of Hubert. It was facing forward, properly forward, in its natural position. She considered this. Then, she went to the window and looked out at the darkening garden, where the sweet peas had closed their petals for the night, and a single light burned in the gardener's cottage beyond the wall. Chapter 7. Thomas makes an admission. The thing about young people, in Miss Marple's experience, was that they invariably gave themselves away on the subject they most wanted to conceal, because the effort of concealing it made them talk around it in elaborate circles, and the circles themselves became the shape of the thing they were hiding. Thomas Hartley had been describing Bristol for 3 days, the flat that was being painted, the particular street he lived on, the excellent Ethiopian restaurant, with the slightly too casual thoroughness of someone telling a story they have prepared in advance. She brought it to an end gently, on the 4th morning, while they were both waiting for Evelyn to come down to breakfast. How long has the painting been taking? She asked, pleasantly, with genuine seeming interest. He looked at her. A short look. Longer than expected, he said. These things do. A pause. I'm not actually having the flat painted, he said, and he said it with the particular relief of someone who has been waiting to say it for several days. I thought perhaps not, said Miss Marple. He sat down at the breakfast table with the slightly deflated quality of someone whose elaborate preparation has not been required. He was not unintelligent, she thought. He was young and under pressure, which produces in most people a tendency toward overcomplication. I left a job, he said, rather abruptly. I needed somewhere to be for a while that wasn't. He stopped. That wasn't where you had been, said Miss Marple. Yes. He looked at his coffee cup. I worked at an investment firm in Bristol. I discovered something about how the accounts were being managed. Something not right. He paused. I said something about it. They were not pleased. I left before they could arrange for me to leave more formally. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. Have you told anyone in an official capacity? I've spoken to a solicitor. He said this with the quiet relief of someone who has done the right thing and is not yet sure what will come of it. A different solicitor, he added, with a faint and fleeting smile. Not Caroline's. Outside, the postwoman could be heard at the gate. The garden smelled of wet earth and late summer roses, and from the kitchen came the sound of Evelyn Hartley's particular brisk step. Does your aunt know? Said Miss Marple. She knows I left the job. She doesn't know why. He looked up. I didn't want to worry her. People are often less fragile than we arrange for them to be, said Miss Marple mildly. He considered this. You're rather good at this, he said, with the directness of the young who have not yet learned the various social conventions that prevent the obvious from being said. At what? Said Miss Marple. Knowing things. She smiled at him with great kindness and said nothing. because the footstep of Evelyn Hartley was now at the kitchen door, and it was an excellent morning, and the coffee was very good, and there was marmalade of the coarse-cut sort that Miss Marple preferred to the fine, and sometimes that was simply enough. Chapter 8. Amy Briggs. On Thursday morning, Amy Briggs arrived at 8 o'clock exactly, let herself in through the side door with a key she had clearly carried for some time, and began the house with the systematic efficiency of someone who knows a place so well that their feet find the right room before their mind has quite decided to go there. She was 25 or thereabouts, with her father's unhurried quality translated in her into something younger and less settled, the same economy of movement, but underneath it, a watchfulness that spoke of a person still working out what precisely they were watching for. She had a small silver ring on her right hand that she turned sometimes when she was thinking, and she kept her hair in a practical knot from which various elements were always escaping with what seemed, in Miss Marple's observation, like a kind of cheerful independence. Miss Marple found reasons to be in whatever room Amy Briggs was cleaning. She did this without artifice, simply being present, doing her own quiet things, and the girl, accustomed to elderly women moving through the house with their knitting and their reading and their unhurried purposes, paid her no particular attention, which was what Miss Marple was hoping for. She listened, not to what Amy said, because Amy said very little during the working hours, she was her father's daughter in this, but to what Amy noticed. There is a quality of attention that can be observed in a person who is genuinely seeing their surroundings rather than moving through them by habit. The way a hand slows near a surface before it dusts it, the way eyes move when they check a room for what should be there. Amy's hands slowed near the console table in the hall, very slightly, and then moved on. At 11 o'clock, when the kettle went on in the kitchen and Evelyn Hartley invited Amy for a cup, which was clearly a standing Thursday arrangement, Miss Marple sat at the kitchen table with her own cup and listened to them talk about the village, the proposed alterations to the cricket pavilion, the uncertain health of Mrs. Pemberton at the post office, with the easy frequency of people who share geography and a degree of mutual regard. And then Amy said, with the slightly over-casual lightness that Miss Marple now recognized as a reliable indicator, that mirror in the hall wants a proper clean. I noticed yesterday there's a mark on it. What sort of mark? Said Evelyn. Greasy sort. Like a handprint almost. She turned her cup. On the lower left corner. Evelyn Hartley looked at Miss Marple. A very brief look, carrying several things, and then she looked back at her tea. Thank you, she said. Yes, do clean it. Miss Marple excused herself not long afterward, and went back to the hallway on the pretext of her knitting bag, which she had not left there, but which served its purpose of bringing her to stand once more in front of the old mirror with its warped corner and its foxed edges. She looked at the lower left corner. There was no handprint there, not even a smear. The glass was clear. Amy Briggs had looked at the mirror, and then mentioned a mark that did not exist. Miss Marple stood still for a moment, looking at her own reflection, a small, neat, elderly woman in a blue cardigan with very clear eyes, and thought about why a person might draw attention to a mirror. In her experience, it was generally for one of two reasons. Either they wanted you to look at the mirror, or they very much did not want you to look at what the mirror reflected. Chapter 9. Morrow's Visits. Dr. Philip Morrow came to the lodge on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. This was a social call in both instances. Evelyn Hartley was in excellent health, which Dr. Morrow monitored with the careful attention he gave all his long-standing patients, but social call had been arranged over so many years that it had acquired a quality of structure, almost of appointment. He always brought a book to lend, which he had always described beforehand in his Tuesday telephone call, and Evelyn always provided a glass of sherry at 5 o'clock, which she poured from a cut-glass decanter that had been her mother's. Miss Marple had formed her impressions of Dr. Morrow over the course of the week with the quiet thoroughness she brought to such things. He was, she concluded, a man who had learned to manage a deep capacity for feeling by directing it into its most useful channels. He cared genuinely for his patients. He was genuinely kind. and he had been in love with Evelyn Hartley for some time, perhaps years, in a manner that was scrupulously restrained and had never, she thought, been acted upon or directly acknowledged. She noticed the way his hands, those careful professional hands, stilled very slightly when Evelyn came into a room. The way he registered her comfort or discomfort with a fraction of a second's extra attention. The way he never sat in the chair closest to her but always the one across, which suggested a distance that was chosen rather than natural. None of this was, in itself, alarming. People loved each other in all sorts of unrequited, unspoken ways, and the world went on perfectly well. But on Thursday afternoon, while the three of them sat in the drawing room with their sherry, she noticed something else. Morrow was looking at the photograph of Hubert, not conspicuously, not with any particular expression, but he looked at it once with a quality of deliberateness, and then arranged his gaze elsewhere with the same deliberateness, in a way that spoke of a person who looks at a thing quite often and has made a practice of appearing not to. Hubert would have enjoyed this summer, said Evelyn, following his look with the ease of someone who has spent years making the same small pilgrimage with her eyes. He liked the dry ones. He was fond of his garden, said Morrow. Obsessively so, said Evelyn with affection. The sweet peas are magnificent, said MissMarple, pleasantly. Briggs's work, said Evelyn. He has a gift for them. A small silence. How is Briggs? Said Morrow, in the tone of a man asking a medical question while pretending to ask a social one. I haven't seen him in some months. Well enough, said Evelyn. Quiet, lately. He has things on his mind. This last phrase had a very slightly formal quality, not Evelyn's natural way of speaking, and it landed in the room and sat there while the sherry was sipped and the afternoon light came through the window at its flattering 5 o'clock angle, gilding the roses and the silver frame and the face of Hubert Hartley, who had been dead for 8 years and whose presence in this room remained. MissMarple felt rather substantially alive. After Morrow had gone, she sat quietly for a moment. Something was troubling her. Not what she had seen, but what she had not seen, or rather what should have been there and wasn't. She turned it in her mind the way one turns a garment to find the thread that is out of place. She went to the hallway and stood in front of the mirror again. In its slight warp she could just see, from this position, the doorway to the drawing room, and through it, at this angle, the side table. And on the side table, in the reflected world of the old glass, the photograph. She could see it quite clearly now, and what she could see made her stand very still indeed. Chapter 10. What the mirror showed. The photograph in the silver frame showed Hubert Hartley, as Evelyn had said. It had been taken in Corfu in 1987. He was standing on a terrace with a blue sea behind him, and he was laughing at something the photographer had said, and he had the look of a man who is entirely comfortable in his life, which is a rarer look in photographs than people tend to suppose. But there was a second photograph. It was behind the first one, angled in such a way that it was quite invisible from the main room, tucked against the frame's back leg, face to the wall, except for a small corner that was visible only from the particular vantage point of the hallway mirror's slight warp, at the right distance, at the right angle, perfectly and specifically invisible from everywhere except here. MissMarple stood very still and looked at it for a long moment. It was a small photograph, the square format of an older camera. It showed two people, and she could not make out the faces clearly from this angle and in this reflection, but she could see that one person was standing and one was seated, and that they appeared to be outdoors, possibly in this very garden, and that the quality of the light suggested summer. She left the hallway and went back to the drawing room, where she sat down with her knitting and did not pick it up. She was thinking about the small disturbances. The photograph turned face to wall, the letter rearranged, the bottles in the cellar, the gloves laid out flat, palms up, in an attitude that was not simply careless, but was, she now thought, deliberately configured, arranged. Someone had wanted Evelyn to feel watched. But someone else, someone with rather different intentions, had hidden a photograph in plain sight. These were not, she was now quite sure, the same person. There were two separate operations happening in this house, two separate intentions, and they were each, in their different ways, trying to influence Evelyn Hartley without her understanding what was being done. The drawing room smelled of roses and beeswax and the faint mineral coolness of the stone fireplace. The clock on the mantelpiece marked the quarter hour. Miss Marple's needles remained still. She was thinking about Briggs's daughter and the non-existent handprint, about Thomas and his Bristol investment firm, about Caroline and the sealed letter she posted herself, about Dr. Morrow and his very precisely arranged distance from the woman he regarded with such careful, controlled attention. And she was thinking about Hubert Hartley, 8 years dead, and the quality of his presence in this house, which was not the presence of someone peacefully remembered, she was now fairly sure, but the presence of someone not yet entirely resolved. She put down her knitting and went to find Evelyn. She found her in the small sitting room at the front of the house, the one where Caroline came in the early mornings, and she knocked on the half-open door in the particular way she had, 3 light taps, spaced, that somehow conveyed both respect and the fact that something important needed. Saying, "Evelyn," she said, "I think I need to ask you 1 or 2 questions. About Hubert." Evelyn looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who has been expecting a particular conversation and has arranged themselves to have it. "Sit down," she said. "I think I had better tell you about Margaret." Chapter 11. Margaret. Margaret Fenwick had been Hubert Hartley's secretary for 7 years, and she had been in love with him for 6 of them, and only Evelyn had known, and Evelyn had managed this knowledge with the enormous careful dignity that had characterized her whole approach to the difficult facts of her marriage. "He was not in love with her," said Evelyn, with the even tone of a woman who has spent 8 years arranging this history into its true shape. "I want to be clear about that. He was fond of her. He was kind to her, in the particular way of men who are kind to people who love them without quite knowing what to do with it. But he did not return her feeling." "She was here," said Miss Marple. "In the garden. Several times. Social occasions. She was part of a professional world. One couldn't entirely separate them." Evelyn looked at the garden through the window. "She left the area when Hubert died. I heard she went to her sister's in Norfolk. I have not heard from her since." "But you believe someone has been sending you a message," said Miss Marple. "The gloves, the photograph turned to the wall, you associate it with her." "I did," said Evelyn. "It felt like a communication of some sort. A claim, the gloves laid out like hands." The photograph of Hubert turned away. She was quiet for a moment. "When Hubert was alive, I wore those gloves to church every Christmas. They were very distinctive. Margaret would have known them." "And the hidden photograph?" said Miss Marple quietly. Evelyn went very still. "What photograph?" she said. Miss Marple described what she had seen in the mirror, the second image, tucked behind the first, visible only from the hallway through the glass's warp. Evelyn stood up and went to the drawing room, and Miss Marple followed her. And Evelyn reached behind the silver frame and extracted a small square photograph with the steadiness of a woman who has perhaps expected to find something there, though not quite this. She looked at it for a long moment. "This is Hubert," she said, "in the garden. And that," she paused, "that is Margaret, sitting in the garden chair." She set the photograph down on the table face up. Her voice was quite steady. "I did not put this here." "No," said Miss Marple. "I didn't think you had. Someone put it here very deliberately." Evelyn's voice was thoughtful now rather than distressed. "Someone who knew where Hubert kept his photographs. He had a box in the study, and who could access this house?" She looked at Miss Marple with the direct, assessing gaze of her excellent practical intelligence. "And someone who knew about the mirror." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "That is the most interesting detail of all. Because the mirror was not a coincidence. That photograph was placed where only a specific view angle, only the mirror, would reveal it. Whoever placed it there knew exactly what that mirror shows." They stood together looking at the 2 photographs side by side. Hubert in Corfu, laughing. Hubert in this garden, beside a woman who had loved him and gone away. The same person did both things, said Evelyn, and it was not quite a question. No, said Miss Marple, very gently. I don't think they did. Evelyn looked at her. I think, said Miss Marple, that the gloves and the turned photograph were intended to make you think of Margaret, to make you anxious, unsettled, make you think the past was returning. And I think the hidden photograph was intended as a correction, a truth placed quietly in the room, waiting to be discovered by someone paying the right kind of attention. A long quiet settled between them. Outside, the afternoon lengthened in the garden, and a blackbird found something of interest near the sweet peas, and considered it with great seriousness. Chapter 12. The Chetford Underwick Archive. It had always been Miss Marple's view that the past, when it became relevant to the present, tended to have left a paper trail somewhere, and that the trick was simply to find a person of the right age and the right temperament who had been paying attention at the time. In St. Mary Mead, this person was invariably Mrs. Price Ridley. In Chetford under Wick, she deduced within her first 48 hours, this person was the postmistress. Mrs. Dorothea Clement had run the post office and general stores for 31 years. She was 73, with a memory that had the quality of a very good card index, not poetic or associative, but precise and retrievable. She knew the birthday of every permanent resident going back 25 years. She knew who had left and in what circumstances, and who had returned and in what circumstances, and she held this knowledge not with malice, but with the quiet civic pride of a person who understands that memory is a form of local history. She also made excellent flapjack, which she kept behind the counter for people she liked. Miss Marple was offered flapjack on her third visit to the post office, which she considered a satisfactory progress. Margaret Fenwick, she said pleasantly, while buying stamps she did not immediately need. Mrs. Clement's expression shifted in a way that was informative without being indiscreet. You'll be staying up at the lodge, she said. I am. She was a nice enough woman, said Mrs. Clement, with the careful qualification of the scrupulously fair. Quiet. Efficient. She came back, you know. Miss Marple waited. Not to stay. Just, she was seen, last month. At the Lamb and Fleece in the evening with a glass of wine and a book. Mrs. Partridge saw her and told me, and I thought, well, she considered her words. She looked well. She didn't make any trouble. She had one glass of wine and left. When was this exactly? Said Miss Marple. 3rd of August. This came out with the immediacy of a person who had not needed to look it up. And the small disturbances at the lodge began approximately 3 weeks ago, said Miss Marple thoughtfully, which would place them beginning around the 2nd week of August. Mrs. Clement was quiet for a moment. I wouldn't like to make an accusation, she said carefully. She looked peaceful, is what Mrs. Partridge said. Not angry, not brooding. Peaceful, said Miss Marple, can mean many things. She paid for her stamps. Thank you very much, Mrs. Clement. The flapjack is exceptionally good. Golden syrup, said Mrs. Clement, and patience. Walking back along the village green in the mild late-morning warmth, Miss Marple turned the timeline over carefully. Margaret Fenwick, seen in the village in August, peaceful, alone with her wine. The disturbances beginning shortly afterward. But there was something else. Someone at the lodge had access to Hubert's photograph box. Someone who knew the mirror. Someone who understood the sightline. She stopped on the green for a moment, looking back at the post office window, and then forward toward the stone wall of Hartley Lodge. She thought about the wine cellar, and the bottles rearranged. About someone who knew which wines were ready and which were not. About the silver letter tray, and where a person would naturally put a letter that had slid beneath it. These were the gestures of someone familiar with the house. Someone who had been here often. Someone for whom the lodge was a place they knew rather than a place they had recently visited. She walked on. She was fairly sure now. She needed one more conversation to be certain. Chapter 13. The Study. It was the study that told her. Hubert Hartley's study had been left largely as it was. This was not, as it might appear, an act of grief or inability to move forward. Evelyn Hartley was too clear-eyed for that, but rather a practical respect for the fact that a study is a working space, and Hubert's work had had ongoing relevance to the estate and its management even after his death. And so the desk remained his desk, and the files remained his files, and the photograph box remained on its shelf between a volume of Hardy and a dry stone walling manual that had the worn look of frequent use. Miss Marple went in after lunch on Friday, with Evelyn's full knowledge and the quiet assistance of knowing where the light switch was. The photograph box was an old chocolate tin, the kind that are made to last, with a painted pastoral scene on the lid. Inside it were photographs in the loose and cheerfully disorganized manner of a man who did not throw things away, but also did not file them. She went through them systematically. There were many photographs of Evelyn. Young Evelyn, middle-aged Evelyn, Evelyn at various Christmas dinners. There were photographs of Caroline at school ages. There were photographs of holidays, a lot of the Greek islands, and several of a sailing holiday in the early 1980s that involved a great deal of slightly too much sun and unidentifiable nautical actions. And there were photographs of the garden. Hubert had loved his garden, and it showed. There were garden photographs going back decades, the rose beds in various states of development, the kitchen garden through its seasons, the sweet peas in their annual incarnations, and in several of them, a young man who was helping. She held one up to the window light. The young man was perhaps 20, and he was digging, with the absorbed and willing quality of someone doing work they find genuinely satisfying. His face was turned toward the camera in one photograph, not posed, just glanced up naturally, and he had her father's unhurried eyes and her father's economy of expression. He looked very like Briggs. He was, in fact, Briggs, a very young Briggs, perhaps 40 years ago, before life had settled the expression into its current form. But, unmistakably, Miss Marple set the photograph aside and went through the rest of the box. She found 3 more with the young Briggs in them. And she found, at the very back, loose, not in an envelope, a note, a folded note written in a handwriting she did not know, on paper that had yellowed at the edges but was still quite legible. It was short. She read it. She stood for a moment in the quiet of Hubert's study, with the smell of old paper and linseed oil and the ghost of pipe tobacco that never quite leaves a room, and she thought about Briggs at his bean canes, saying she's seen things she shouldn't have. She thought about Amy Briggs and the non-existent handprint, Amy drawing attention to the mirror so deliberately, Amy who came to this house every week and knew it as well as her own. And she thought, with the small click of something fitting properly into its place after being held at an awkward angle, about who had put the second photograph there. And why? Not a threat, a gift. Chapter 14. Evening in the garden. She found Amy Briggs at the kitchen door at 4:30, returning an item of baking equipment her mother had apparently borrowed, and she asked her, very quietly, if she would mind sitting in the garden for a few minutes. Amy Briggs looked at her steadily. She was not, it turned out, particularly surprised. They sat on the bench beside the sweet peas in the long, warm light of a Friday afternoon. The garden at this hour smelled of sun-warmed stone and the faint vanilla of the sweet peas, and something deeper, the accumulated smell of all the summers a garden has known, which is quite distinct from any individual element within it. "Your father worked here as a young man," said Miss Marple. "Not a question. Since he was 16, said Amy. "Mr. Hartley, the late Mr. Hartley, gave him his first proper position. And they knew each other well." "Very well," said Amy. She turned the silver ring on her right hand in the way Miss Marple had noticed before, a thinking gesture, entirely unconscious. "Mr. Hartley was a good man. He was kind to my father. There are things my father doesn't talk about, but I know about, because Mum told me when I was old enough to understand them. She paused. When my dad was having a very bad time, he was 22, 23, troubles I won't go into, Mr. Hartley stood by him. Properly stood by him. There's not many who would have. Miss Marple nodded, watching the sweet peas move very slightly in a breath of air. You put the photograph behind the frame, said Miss Marple. Amy Briggs was quiet for a moment. I found it in the box in the study, she said. I was dusting. I saw it, and She stopped. It's just her with him in the garden. Nothing improper. Nothing to make anyone think badly of anyone. But it shows her as a person. A real person who was here, and who he was kind to, like he was kind to my father. She paused. All these months, Mrs. Hartley has had those other things happening, the photograph turned, the gloves, and I knew it was meant to make her think of Margaret Fenwick in a bad light, make her feel something frightening about her. And that wasn't right. You knew who was doing those things, said Miss Marple. Amy looked at the sweet peas for a moment. I had an idea, she said carefully. The mirror, said Miss Marple. You knew exactly where to put the photograph so that only someone looking in the mirror from the hall would see it. I've known this house since I was 5 years old, said Amy. I know what that mirror shows. I thought whoever was paying proper attention would find it, and whoever found it would understand. Who moved the gloves, Amy? A longer pause this time. I believe, said Amy, slowly and choosing each word with care, that someone who was in this house and knows it very well has been unsettling Mrs. Hartley on purpose. And I believe it began as something small, jealousy, perhaps, or old feeling, and it grew into something that person couldn't quite stop. She paused. I don't want to say a name when I'm not certain. But you are certain, said Miss Marple, very gently. The bench was warm from the afternoon sun, and a bee passed through the sweet peas beside them with complete and magnificent indifference to the human conversation. And somewhere over the wall the gardener's cottage was quiet. Yes, said Amy Briggs, at last. I suppose I am. The name she said was one that Miss Marple had already prepared herself to hear. Chapter 15. The Resolution of Small Things. Miss Marple had a conversation with Dr. Philip Morrow on Saturday morning that lasted 20 minutes, took place in the drawing room with the door closed, and was conducted on both sides with perfect courtesy and some considerable directness. She began by telling him what she knew, which she did in the manner she always used for such conversations, without preamble, without drama, and without any particular unkindness, because unkindness, in her experience, was rarely useful and almost always counterproductive. He had moved the gloves. He had turned the photograph. He had rearranged the bottles in the cellar, which he knew, from long social access to the house, precisely as a person arranging a familiar kitchen would know it. He had slid the letter beneath the tray, which was such a small thing that it barely counted. He had not, initially, intended anything beyond creating a small unease, making Evelyn think of the past, think of what had been uncertain in it, perhaps come to him more frequently, lean on him in some small way. It had begun, she suspected, not from cruelty, but from a particular kind of loneliness, which does not excuse it, but does explain it somewhat. He was quiet throughout. When she had finished, he said, "You are not going to the police." "No," she said. "These things are not criminal. They are merely unkind." She paused. "But you will stop. And you will tell Evelyn. Not everything, but enough. You will tell her that you have been behaving foolishly, and you will use approximately those words, and she will understand what you mean, because she is an intelligent woman, and you will apologize to her with the sincerity that I believe you are, underneath all this, entirely capable of." He looked at the carpet for a moment. Then he looked up. "I have been," he said carefully, "an idiot." "Yes," said Miss Marple, pleasantly, "but a redeemable one, I think." He left at 11 o'clock and returned at 3 and was closeted with Evelyn in the sitting room for 40 minutes. Miss Marple sat in the garden with Thomas and Caroline, who had, over the course of the week, reached a kind of sibling equilibrium, imperfect and familiar, the sort that re-establishes itself without needing to be announced, and drank tea, and did not explain what was happening inside the house. Because it was not her explanation to make. Thomas had spoken with his aunt about Bristol that morning, and the conversation had gone, he reported, rather well. Evelyn had said several useful things and asked several correct questions, and had, apparently, known something was wrong in any case, which Thomas had found simultaneously embarrassing and comforting. Caroline had received a letter that day, not through the post, but left on the hall table in an envelope in Evelyn's handwriting, and whatever it contained had made her sit in the garden for an hour by herself, with the slightly astonished expression of someone who has been told something they needed to hear and had not expected to receive. Margaret Fenwick remained in Norfolk, as far as anyone knew, and had come to the Lamb and Fleece for a glass of wine and a book, because she was passing through, and the evening was long, and the public house was familiar, and she had then gone away again without causing or seeking trouble, which was the unremarkable and peaceful truth of a story that had been made to seem haunting. The photograph of her and Hubert in the garden, summer of 1994, from the quality of the light, sat now face up on the side table beside Hubert's Corfu photograph, the two images sitting beside each other with the placid companionability of things that have been made honestly and have nothing to be ashamed of. Evelyn had put it there herself. It was Sunday morning, the last morning of Miss Marple's visit, and she sat in the garden in the particular light of an English August morning that has had the good grace to give you a proper summer day before autumn arrives. Warm, clear, the blue of the sky, a blue that commits itself. The sweet peas were at their finest. Briggs moved along his bean canes with his habitual measured purpose. From the kitchen came the sound of breakfast being prepared with cheerful domesticity. Miss Marple sat with her knitting in her lap, the periwinkle cornflower cardigan now nearly complete, and watched a cabbage white butterfly consider the sweet peas and then consider again, in the unresolved manner of things that are not yet quite decided. She thought about mirrors, and what they show you depending on where you stand. She thought about how the same glass that had hidden the truth had also, in the end, been the thing that revealed it. The slight warp, the particular angle, the deliberate placement by a young woman who had grown up in this house and knew its every secret, and had chosen to put a piece of honesty. Somewhere it could be found by someone paying the right sort of attention. There was a lesson in that somewhere, she supposed, about how truth generally contrives to be visible, in the end, if you position yourself correctly. She picked up her knitting. Evelyn came out through the French doors with 2 cups of coffee, which was a departure from their usual tea, but seemed, this morning, exactly right. "Are you certain you won't stay another week?" said Evelyn, settling into the chair beside her. "I must get back to my garden," said Miss Marple. "The dahlias will be thinking of me." "Do dahlias think?" "Oh, I believe plants are more aware of us than we generally suppose," said Miss Marple. "We simply don't pay them sufficient attention." She finished one row of knitting and turned the work in her hands and began the next, and the morning extended itself around them with the calm satisfaction of a garden that has been properly tended, and a summer that has given what it promised, and a household that has been, with some effort and no small amount of patience, returned to something resembling itself. The cabbage white butterfly made its decision. It settled on the sweet peas, and was still. Miss Marple knitted on.